Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I told you it was going to be less than 5 minutes. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. My guest tonight, David Ansara from CRA, Center for Risk Analysis. Once again, links in the description. David, how are you doing, man?
I'm fantastic, Joe. Always good to be on your show, and great to have everyone join us tonight.
Fantastic. Just I forgot to mention to you. Sorry, I should have mentioned this to you before you came on. If there's a bit of a lag, there's a up and down arrow somewhere, a symbol somewhere on your side.
Oh
If you
yes,
click it,
got it.
yeah, it will solve the lag issue. Um,
I'm always getting confused between up and down, so forgive me.
no worries. Um, cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we're here to talk about tonight is David. I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know policy, right? Like that's like your thing. You like read policy, you analyze it, correct?
Yes, that's a fair assessment, and not only just read it, but try to convey to our clients, who are a number of corporates, individuals, small business owners, foreign embassies, etc. What are the risks that lie in those policies? And policy is not just a kind of a technocratic exercise. It's not like, okay, well, there's this thing called policies, and they kind of come out of a machine, and it's just a question of how you calibrate the machine. And if you have the right policies, then you will have the right outcomes. Policy is obviously very important, but policy is a reflection of the prevailing ideology of the politics of the day. And so we always tell our clients that policy is downstream from ideology. And so we, I think, do things a little bit differently at the CRA, is that we try to unpack what are the ideological drivers behind, for example, South African politics. The African National Congress as the incumbent party that's been in power for, what is it now, since 1994, 28 years and counting. So we at the CRA have been doing that for many decades, and yeah, hopefully we can get into some of those policies and how they impact on not only businesses but ordinary people's lives on a day-to-day basis, in this discussion tonight.
Yeah, that's absolutely the plan. But before we do, I just want to say hi to Amy. She's joined us. Hello, Amy. Thank you so much for tuning in. And Clay Wilson letting you know, Dave, that he's a subscriber to CRA and he enjoys your written pieces on the Daily Friend.
Oh, thank you very much, Clay.
And
Good to know
Math
that somebody's reading it.
and Matthew wants you to know that David looks Amish, but with a nice shirt. um,
I'll take that
I,
as a compliment.
yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, do send in your questions, and I will keep an eye on them, and I will ask them towards the end of our discussion. There's just a few things that I want to speak to David on right away. But like I said, don't be shy. Ask your questions. I will get to them at a later stage. Acid Zill, I see you, and I will ask him later. Okay, so David, the reason why I wanted to get you on the show to chat about is because, like, you just explained what you do, and I think it's great. And you're just the man I need to talk to about this because I've been told on social media that the private sector of South Africa is either partially to blame or actually a lot, like a big part to blame also for the decay of South Africa. This one individual that I was speaking to was saying that how I'll disclaim and say that he is a Marxist. So take it with a pinch of salt. But, explaining how capitalism is the problem and so many people are still poor. Capitalism hasn't helped South Africans get out of poverty and blah, blah, blah. And I watch, obviously, a lot of CRA. I enjoy your channels. And, it got me thinking, like, surely it's not capitalism as it is. It's more the policies of the ANC. Am I correct in saying that?
So that's a tough question to answer. I'm not just saying that because I'm playing for time, but I think you also have to disaggregate this thing called the private sector. There's no monolithic entity called the private sector. It's just a whole collection of businesses, different interests, all competing with one another and vying for influence, for resources, for power, etc. But I think it's very interesting to look at the history of business in South Africa. And I think one of the points that you look at, if you go back in time throughout the apartheid period, even back to the early 20th century, you've seen that business has always been had somewhat of an ambivalent relationship with politicians. When there was the big gold rush in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a view that, well, politics is for politicians. We just want to make as much money. All throughout the apartheid period, business was, until quite late in the day, quite reluctant to play an active political role. But did, during the transition, organizations like Anglo-American, for example, they supported various initiatives. Helped to set up the National Union of Mine Workers, actually, with Cyril Ramaphosa. Funded a number of bursary programs, and also was quite active in trying to nudge the apartheid state towards negotiations. But really, the writing was on the wall at that point. So, during the transition and into the democratic era, business very quickly switched allegiance. And again, I'm caveating this by speaking in broad terms when I talk about business. But what we've observed over the last 3 decades of ANC rule is that business has kind of gone along to get along. They've often given rhetorical support to many ANC policies, some of which have been outright hostile to growth in South Africa. And that often strikes you as a contradiction. Well, why would business do that? Why would, if they could see the hostile effects of policy, the damage that causes, then why would they advocate for those policies? And so I think also you have to necessarily decouple this idea of business and free markets. Sometimes businesses that have a monopoly position or an advantage of incumbency can often use that position to lobby for regulatory protection, and that they actively court politicians. And sometimes, particularly the onerous regulatory burden that is imposed, say, for example, through Black economic empowerment, that is far easier for a large listed corporation to comply with than the little guy. So what often happens is you have this huge thicket of regulatory compliance, box-checking kinds of exercises, and that frustrates and bogs down small businesses, whereas a big multinational corporate, they can just hire a few compliance people and have a dedicated department, and that often benefits them. If you consider, for example, in the telecoms industry, there are 2 major players. It's essentially a duopoly. Telkom plays a role as well, and there's starting to be some competition more on the data side. But in terms of cell phone coverage, it's really the 2 big players, and the telecommunications regulatory framework makes it really difficult for you to get a license, for you to start competing. So, I think that we need a lot more competition in South Africa, and the government's answer to that is, well, we need a Department of Trade and Industry and Competition to go and clobber businesses that are seen to be too strong, too powerful. But our approach would be, well, rather deregulate some of these sectors, allow for more competition to come in and to challenge those incumbents. So the short answer is that business often does play an enabling role. And what we see is, particularly with the current president, his leadership style is that kind of consensus model. And so he will organize conferences, lachotlas and indabas, where he gets all of the so-called stakeholders around the table: business, labor, the government representatives, and they'll kind of hammer out a deal. But this takes place entirely separately from the legislative process, which is where the real democratic process should happen, and creates what I would term a corporatist compact, that the elites in these forums negotiate according to their interests, which is often at the expense of new emerging businesses. And so BEE is a big part of that. It's about transferring equity to politically connected individuals who are close to the party, and about creating this impression of inclusivity, etc. But really, the result is that many emerging, particularly black businesses, get left on the margins. So I hope that answers your question, Joe.
Oh, well, it actually does. I mean, you've given me a lot to think about, and also, like, it kind of makes sense. Is it, would you say it's also kind of cronyism in a way?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. So, and particularly because we have weak political institutions in South Africa, we have a lot of transparency. So the press often will run with stories around corruption and malfeasance. There's commissions of inquiry like the Zondo Commission. There's a lot of naming and shaming, but very little accountability. So we have high degrees of transparency, low degrees of accountability, similar to, say, Nigeria, for example. Our corruption is not quite as bad as Nigeria's, thankfully, but we're getting there.
Yeah, not yet.
So yeah, so that cronyism might involve capital accumulation, and the beneficiaries of that will have all of the trappings of wealth. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wealth per se if you want to drive a fancy car because you have made a business that contributes great value and which the market rewards you for that. That's fantastic. That's the real engine of growth. But when it's because of your proximity to the state, your ability to access a procurement contract on a preferential basis because of preferential procurement policy, then that's quite damaging. That creates this class of crony capitalists that you referred to. And so you want more capitalism, less cronyism. And capitalism involves free individuals competing in an open market, light touch regulation, and the state playing a much smaller role, more of an oversight role, rather than its current role of trying to pick winners and losers.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining it the way you've just explained it, because those are the words I try and explain to some people, because it's exactly what I thought in a way, what you just said. And I try and, you're much better with words than I am. So I'll just clip this and send it to people now when they they give me a hard time. But yeah, no, I thought it was like that. And but I also want to ask you about, you're a policy man. I want to ask you about policies. Let's get deeper into it. Like, we mentioned BEE, right? And that's a very touchy subject for some South Africans. Immediately, some South Africans would be like, "Oh, you're racist now," or like, that's not true. It does help South Africans, blah blah blah. I don't know if that's something you want to really get into, but what other policies are hindering small businesses, or is it just BEE?
Well, look, I think BEE it plays a big role in stifling business, and I mentioned procurement. And so procurement is when the state needs to buy goods and services. It doesn't produce everything itself. It needs to purchase some critical goods and services. So it will put out bids for tenders, for contracts. But the Preferential Procurement Act stipulates what kinds of entities need to qualify for this. And actually, the business group Sakelicha has just won a really critical case at the Constitutional Court regarding the pre-selection criteria that is applied by the National Treasury. So when Pravin Gordhan was the finance minister back in 2017, Sakelicha launched this case, this challenge to the finance minister who he was at the time, and saying that this essentially is an unfair practice. It's also it goes beyond his ministerial powers, that he is imposing this rule on all state entities. The Rule of Law Project advocate Mark Oppenheimer, who I think was on your show last week, his representation was that this flies in the face of the non-racialism provision of Chapter 1 of the Constitution, which is one of the founding principles of the Constitution, which you may have noticed doesn't get mentioned very much, even by the Constitutional Court itself, which is lamentable. But nevertheless, the Constitutional Court, in a split judgment, came out in favor of Sakelicha. But now we're seeing the National Treasury is saying they want to put a moratorium on all procurement contracts until they've clarified this and rewritten the legislation, which means that the normal functionings of the state are essentially put on hold for a while, which seems to be to the disadvantage of ordinary citizens who rely on state services. So I think that shows you the role of ideology there, because you would think, well, we're dealing with low growth environment. We need the state to be lean and efficient. And the president has said we need a capable state. But how committed is he to this idea of the capable state if he's going to effectively lock out so many businesses from potentially doing business with the state? Our advice, by the way, is to hedge yourself against that and don't do business with the state. Often it can be quite tempting to see this lucrative state contract, but those processes are so abused. The state can then use that relationship as leverage over you. That's why another reason why you see often businesses a bit reluctant to openly criticize the state is because they have a commercial relationship with the state and they don't want to rock the boat. That's nothing new to the particular time that we're in. That's something that's characterized business throughout South Africa's history, but that's one of the reasons, just per our earlier discussion.
Yeah.
But, so just getting back to the ideological point, if this doesn't make sense for the proper functioning of the state, why then is the government so intent on imposing that? There must be some other motivator that is prevailing upon them. And there again, you have the very kind of racial nationalist element of the ANC coming through, that we need to use the state and we need to use the levers of the state to benefit our people. And that really flies in the face of the kind of non-racial ethos that the new South Africa was founded upon. And that first chapter of the Constitution really so beautifully articulates that. So you see there's a tension there that on the one hand, the ANC said, oh no, we're constitutionalists and we're committed to upholding the Constitution. On the other hand, they fly in the face of some of those core values and also want to amend the Constitution. Luckily, they weren't able to do that in December last year. So I think that demonstrates to you, A, how damaging some of the policies can be, and B, how ideologically motivated those policies are.
No, absolutely. I think you make a good point about the Constitution. What chapter was it about the racial stuff?
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. So the first chapter, when you open the Constitution, that's what it's talking about, and they are being hypocritical in a way about it. So yeah, well, I guess that tells you everything you need to know about the ANC. But yeah, so I think one of the other questions I wanted to ask you very quickly as well is if BEE, do you think that's going to be, because you brought up Sakhalega making that awesome win, do you think BEE is something that's going to be scrapped maybe in the next few years?
So I wouldn't bank on the ANC voluntarily withdrawing it. And I think it's important to note that the ANC's philosophy is really rooted in a kind of 1960s style Marxist-Leninist kind of approach. And the Morogoro Conference in 1969 was when the ANC formally adopted the principle, the strategy of the National Democratic Revolution, which very simply aimed to capture the state through a bourgeois revolution, through a democratic election or some kind of transition to power. Then the second phase is the NDR. That is the capture of the state in its entirety and using the state basically to dramatically redistribute wealth, to impose the will of the people, and also to bring about the second socialist revolution in the country. So the first phase is the bourgeois revolution. The second phase is the socialist revolution. This is all over ANC policy documents. You can go and look it up on the internet. It's not just a conspiracy theory or my reading of the situation. How does that influence this discussion now? Well, part of this approach is that what they call the balance of forces. So that is an assessment of the material conditions in the political environment, whether or not those conditions are either favorable to advancing the agenda or hostile, in which case you need to make a strategic retreat. So often what will happen, and this is another reason why business sometimes misreads the ANC's intentions, is that the ANC will advance a proposal, so expropriation without compensation or national health insurance, and it will push it as far as it meets resistance from embedded interests. And if that resistance is strong enough, it will engage in that strategic retreat. But that doesn't mean that the policy is off the table. So, for example, with EWC, the constitutional amendment process failed to go through Parliament in December, so the constitution remained intact. But then there's the EWC Bill. So on the one hand, that process is withdrawn, but then on the other hand, there's now this separate piece of legislation which seeks to impose expropriation through another means. So that shows you that there's this constant swinging of the pendulum back and forth. And I think that that's really critical in terms of understanding where business sometimes missteps. Is business will often engage in good faith. They'll say, okay, well, look, there's this EWC proposal on the table. Let's try and get around the table, all the parties, and let's try and just give our case. And if we give it in a rational way, if we articulate ourselves well, and if we have a polite cup of tea with the minister, then he'll see our point of view, and then he'll change his mind. That's not how an ANC cabinet minister works. He works through this contest of power, and it's only until you meet a corresponding force that he will then withdraw. So that's why it's also important to engage in hard advocacy and to say, well, no, here is a line in the sand. You can't go further than this. Property rights are a fundamental part of a market economy. They are the foundation of wealth. You cannot dilute property rights. It's like you can't be half pregnant. You either have property rights or you don't have them. So in that sense, what I observed through that process was a lot of this good faith dialogue doesn't really factor into the ANC's calculations. It's more about these harder calculations of power and how far they can push their ideological agenda.
No, absolutely. I'm glad you bring up EWC. I wanted to ask you, but I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. EWC, you said there's two bills. What's the difference between the two? Because I'm struggling to understand what exactly, because I thought they dealt with it last year, and then it was not voted in because the EFF and the ANC couldn't come to terms or agreement, so it was scrapped. But then now there's a bill. So what exactly is the difference between the two?
So expropriation is part of the normal functioning of the state, but it's compensated expropriation. So, for example, when the Gautrain was built, some of that railway infrastructure had to go through people's homes, but you needed to have that property used. So there were homes that were expropriated, but with compensation at a market value. And there is legislation that governs that today for those kinds of instances. And that legislation is from, I think, the 1970s. So the argument is that needs to be brought up to date. So that's the one process, the EWC Bill, which is that secondary process. The process that you were referring to in December that got shot down was an actual amendment of the Constitution. Section 25 was around property rights, and there it said the state may engage in expropriation, but it must be with compensation. There was proposals to change that clause of the Constitution. That was a far more fundamental and consequential policy event. And I think it was a very good thing that the 2/3 majority wasn't met in that process. But the EWC bill only needs a simple majority to pass. It still needs to be in line with the Constitution, though. So there is still that important check. that Section 25 will apply to this legislation. But you must be very careful that there isn't that the wording of that the original draft proposal had something like 5 or 6 conditions in which expropriation without compensation may take place, and it said including but not limited to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like for example an abandoned building or something like that. But that including but not limited to, that means that there are other categories that could just be snuck in there. So I think there's been a lot of campaigning by the IRR and other organizations to say, well, no, that needs to be tightened up. That legislation is still being reviewed, not as damaging as the constitutional amendment would have been, but still some risks lurking in the wording there of that legislation.
And the amendment, the one that was last year, can ANC, like, maybe, I don't know, end of this year want to challenge it again in Parliament? Like, can they keep on trying to push it, or is it once they've ruled on it, it's like done?
Well, that process was a very long process. So there was a ad hoc committee that was established to field submissions from the public. There were all sorts of hearings. A lot of those were kind of sham processes where supporters were bussed in. This was kind of pre-COVID, just before COVID. But so that trying to repeat that process is going to be very difficult. The ANC itself has also become politically weaker since then, with the loss of the major metros in the November 21 elections. So their bargaining power, their position politically is a lot weaker as well. And the EFF knows that and is using the leverage that it now has over the ANC. So at the national level, the results are still the same as they were in 2019. But in terms of the broader perception of the political power of the ANC, that's a lot weaker, and we can get into that in more detail if you like. But the EFF knows its power there, that it has over the ANC, but its calculations could change. It could one day wake up and decide, well, no, it's actually more beneficial for us to lend support to this. And in some ways, the more radical than thou approach that the EFF had, for them, the constitutional amendment process was not nearly far enough. I would have said it would have been pretty damaging already, the ANC version. But we kind of got stuck there, which I think is a good thing. And I think it shows you also why, in many respects, it's a positive development that we're having more fragmentation of South Africa's political landscape, because it means that politics is now going to be a lot more issue-driven. What happens within the ANC is going to become less important than how the ANC interacts with other players. And it's going to create a lot more volatility and uncertainty and fluidity, but it's also going to mean that there's going to be more competition in the environment. There's going to be more issue-driven approach to politics rather than just this kind of hegemonic power that the ANC has enjoyed for so long.
All right. I don't know if that's a positive. I'm worried about what that road could lead to. You guys at the CRA have been saying that there is possibly another July riot in the future, which is worrying, to say the least. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but I guess time will tell. I wanted to ask you before, I'm going to ask you a bit about some of the stuff you just spoke about, but I really want to ask you about basic income grants. I know the current financial minister didn't really mention it in the budget speech, which a lot of people are saying is a good thing. But there still seems in the mainstream media to be a push for it. Like there's a lot of articles about it that say like, we need it. There was a protest, I think last week or the week before. I think it was they were protesting for 1,500 Rand basic income grant. Where does the CRA stand with that? Even just you as David, where do you stand with that as a thing to bring in now?
Well, South Africa already has a very extensive welfare system. And lamentably, we have far more people who are receiving welfare grants, especially the special COVID relief grant, which has been extended another 12 months. many more people receiving grants than we have in jobs. And the number of people in jobs has gone down to about 15 million or so, 14 million. So we've lost about 2 million throughout the lockdown, which is really tragic for those people. So the basic income grant, look, that would be fiscally a huge burden for the government to take on. That would mean also replacing the entire SASA system as it exists, probably using SARS for that to administer that. That would also create a huge transaction cost or transition cost. And the SASA system works pretty well, actually. It's a non-racial system, which is one of the few non-racial policies in South Africa these days. And yeah, there's sometimes are a few problems with it and what have you, but everyone has their card. They can get access to those funds. And there is fraud that occasionally happens there. There's administrative problems, but generally the system kind of works. Whether or not it's a good idea to have that many people on welfare and how sustainable that is a separate question. So perhaps you could make an argument that people who are extremely impoverished, they're effectively locked out of the labor market because they're undereducated, or they have a physical disability, or they're too old. The state has a duty to take care of them. But the vast majority of the people who are receiving those grants are able-bodied, working-age people who could contribute meaningfully to economic activity. And our education system has let people down immensely, but that is not an excuse for getting people to work. Countries like Ethiopia, Vietnam, they also have not necessarily had necessarily good education outcomes, but they have very low levels of unemployment. Why is that? It's because they have prioritized low value adding, export driven job creation, high intensity manufacturing, agriculture, and mining as well. So that really helps for you to absorb those low skill people into the working population. At the moment, we have this kind of small elite of services driven type of businesses. So retail, insurance, financial services, tourism, non-industrial kinds of activities. We've got still a thriving agricultural sector in terms of exports, but the amount of labor that's used in the agricultural sector has gone down quite a lot because a lot of farmers are first of all expanding the size of their farms and their operations to scale up and to take advantage of new technologies, automation and so on. But also to have large workforces is a bit of a risk. So those traditional areas where job creation used to take place, agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, have kind of shrunk relative to other areas. And so we need to bolster those up again. We need to really have a serious hard look at our labor regulatory framework. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, all of these serve to exclude millions of people from work. And the driver for this, again, ideology, is that the government's view of the private sector is that business is somehow this dirty, exploitative thing. The profit motive is driven by is what's making all these greedy capitalists exploit workers. They don't see capital formation, the free exchange of goods and services as creating the benefits that it can. And we've seen that all over the world, that free markets, a thriving middle class and business sector really are the drivers of growth and can alleviate poverty on scale. So how does this fit in with the basic income grant? This is more state paternalism. This is more dependency on the ANC government. I think that there's a strong argument to be made that the ANC sees this as a way of buying ongoing support into the future, particularly from rural constituents. And, I think You also have to look at the fiscal considerations here. Michael Sachs, who was a former Treasury official, by no means a kind of free market libertarian. He's somebody who very much believes in the idea of the developmental state. He's saying in a recent paper, like, we just can't afford the basic income grant. This would be fiscally ruinous. It would drive up our borrowing. It would widen the deficit, and that would mean that there'd be less money available for other things like infrastructure, schools, policing, etc. So I would say that our position would be very critical and skeptical of the basic income grant. Rather fix the problems in the labor market. And these would be fairly low-cost financial interventions. You could, with the stroke of a pen, remove some of these restrictions. But the political cost will be high, and the ANC government isn't willing to pay that cost at the moment.
I see. Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think the whole welfare and basic income grant is just like their ace in the hole almost to buy those votes. I just want to go quickly to a comment here. A question. I'm a bit late. What is the subject? So for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm sitting with David Ansara. He is from the Center for Risk Analysis. Link in the description, ladies and gentlemen. So please go give Center for Risk Analysis a subscribe, and also check out David Solutions with David Ansara, where he does once a week episodes where he interviews interesting people. David, I was trying to remember, who was the most high profile person you've had on Solutions with David Ansara?
Gee, well, they all have so much to offer and so many unique perspectives. I think an interview that I had last week was very interesting. It was with Johan Norberg, who is an economic historian. And part of his work, he wrote this book. I've actually got it over here. It's called Open. And it's a fascinating story of the role of free trade, of the free movement of people through migration, and also this kind of an attitudinal position that many societies that are more open to outside influences are actually end up being more receptive to new ideas, more innovative, more technologically advanced. And this isn't necessarily to say that, for example, Western countries are more open. Many liberal democracies in the West have benefited from prolonged periods of openness, but they've also had periods of closeness, where they've shut their borders, they've looked inward. The same is the case in Asia, for example, in China. There's been many cycles of periods of relative openness and closure. And you can see, for example, in the Middle Ages in Europe as well, how that very long period of hostility to ideas that challenged the dominant powers at the time, how that resulted in declines in literacy, declines in standards of living, declines in the quality of life of people. And when the Renaissance hit again, then all of that innovation and dynamism and new ideas came to the fore. So really fascinating history of human progress and ideas. That's somebody who I found very fascinating and who I'd encourage your viewers to check out.
Yeah, it sounds very fascinating. I've listened to a few of your episodes, obviously, and I have here Clay Wilson, who says he's subscribed. So thank you, Clay, for subscribing. It is a long format podcast, ladies and gentlemen. So if you are someone who doesn't really listen to podcasts on YouTube, David, you are available. Solutions with David Ansara is available on all the podcasting channels, correct?
Yeah, wherever you get your podcasts, you can listen to it on the go. So you don't need to sit in front of your computer and watch the whole 45 to 60-minute episode.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, please go check out Solutions David Ansara. Congratulations, by the way. I just noticed you got 2,000 subs in under a year. Dude.
Oh, thanks, Joe.
You're going to catch up to me soon.
Well, you're on what, about 3.7? So
yeah, but I've been stuck here for like 5 months.
No, that must be because YouTube is choking off your controversial content.
Yeah, no, so controversial. I mean, we said BE is a bad idea. No, okay. So let's get back to it. I now you mentioned something as well that I wanted to ask about, and now I got sidetracked. But yeah. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's that's actually what I wanted to say as well. We're talking about, or we were talking about, is business in South Africa, or is the private sector rather, to blame for the decay of South Africa? And I think, you know, if you're watching this after the fact, just rewind a little bit. David explains it very eloquently, very fairly, I think. And yeah, I would say that both are to blame as well. There is a difference between cronyism and capitalism, and David explains this as well. So please do go back and watch that.
Joe, I would say one thing, which is that, if you consider how deeply state failure runs into almost every political institution in South Africa, and you consider the things that work in South Africa, things
Yeah.
that work in South Africa tend to be private sector run. So I don't think we should do too much private sector bashing in this conversation. If you consider the retail space, for example,
Yeah.
uh, that delivers food into the homes of millions of South Africans every single month, and the banking system as well. It's pretty sophisticated compared to other emerging markets and even developed markets. So without that thriving private sector, South Africa would be in a lot worse off position. But in terms of businesses' political role, I think they have been quite equivocal, and understandably so. I mentioned Sakaliga, and on my podcast, I did have
Yeah.
Pete LaRue last year, and he said, as business, you don't want to be on government's radar. Sometimes you can be so small that you fly below the radar, that you're not really a significant player, but you're just kind of making ends meet as your small SMME. Or you're so big that government can't hurt you. If you think of a mining company like Sibanye, for example, they're the largest private sector employer in the country. I think commodities are really what's driving a lot of government revenues at the moment. So they have a much stronger bargaining position. Interestingly, as an aside, the CEO has said that business needs to take on a more transactional approach with government rather than a consensus-seeking approach with government, to know that it has bargaining power in its discussions and its negotiations. That's something that perhaps more businesses should be looking into. But yeah, and so Peter was saying you don't want to be on the government's radar, and understandably so. You don't want to be victimized by hostile policy or petty officials that might want to target and undermine your business. And I think he also echoed the argument of you want to try and minimize your exposure to the state in terms of doing business with the state as well, because that is a risk. So I understand why many big businesses, they just want to kind of play nice with government and hope that they can play a bit of a long game. But ultimately, what ends up happening is that it gives legitimacy and cover to bad policies, because when an extremely hostile policy is put on the table, and then you say, okay, well, that's 100% hostile, let's make it 50% hostile in a negotiation, you're still left with this, what is ultimately a negative policy. So that's why sometimes you need to draw hard lines and just say, no, we're just not going to engage in this discussion. This is foolish. Like a discussion around national health insurance, we can't afford it. It would crowd out the private sector health providers. Just sort out the hospitals first. Do the basics of public healthcare right before you try to create an ESCOM of healthcare that will be looted and prone to all sorts of governance failures and so on. Just take it off the table. Don't pretend that this is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. David explained it again in a nutshell. But there's more details if you rewind. And then Tracy actually reminded me what I wanted to ask you, because she says here, small companies cannot afford minimum wage, which leads to less employees. The minimum wage thing, right? So like that's also like a touchy subject for some South Africans, okay? They're like, no, we need a minimum wage, it needs to be higher, blah, 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 blah. Can you explain why the increase in the minimum wage is a bad idea?
Well, imagine that you're a poor person, Joe, and
I don't have to imagine.
you. Well, whoever's employing you, Joe, should pay you more, right?
Yeah, okay, I'll let you send them an email.
You must tell those pubs at the comedy gigs
Yeah.
to book it up. But yeah, so you're an average poor person in South Africa. You don't have skills. You've been let down by the education system and by the legacies of the past. You don't have capital because you haven't been able to save. You're just living month to month. You don't have social capitals. You don't have networks that you can leverage to create opportunities. Everyone in your community is suffering a similar fate. But the one thing you do have is your willingness to work. You're willing to go and stand on the side of the street with a little cardboard sign saying, "Yeah, I can do your painting. I can do your hedge trimming." And so what you're effectively saying to that person is, sorry, we don't think that the price that you're willing to work for is sufficient. That's indecent, to use the terminology that the government uses. And that, I think, is strikingly unfair. To take that one source of opportunity away from that person, say like, sorry, you can't work. You just have to be dependent on the state. Here's an income grant for you. You must be grateful that you're getting this grant. Please vote for us at the next elections. But you're not allowed to work for under that wage. And 20 rand an hour, I think it's going up now. Doesn't seem like very much. But to a poor person, that can be the difference between a sustainable livelihood and dependency on the state or on family or handouts from some other source. So I think we must think really carefully about when we infringe on that right to work, and that is also a constitutional principle, the right to work. And I think we need to bolster that. We need to enhance that. And work is not just also about income, right? It's also part of your identity, part of how you see yourself as a member of society. I'm proud of the work that I'm doing, and this is the value that I'm adding to my community and on behalf of my family. So income is really important. Just something that I always point out in these conversations. The government has its own expanded public works program, which is essentially a make work scheme where they get people who are jobless to come and dig trenches or to wave the red flag on the highway when there's some construction going on, etc. And the expanded public works program wages are lower than the minimum wage. So they're about 11 or 12 rand an hour. So what does that tell you? So the government's happy to impose this higher threshold on the private sector, but when it comes to their own employees, well, no, that's too financially costly. So Nicola Nattrass and Jeremy Seekings, who are sociologists from the University of Cape Town, also by no means kind of free market dogmatists, they're saying, well, if you're going to have a minimum wage, at least lower it to the same rate as the expanded public works program, because that seems an unfair burden to be imposing on business. Again, I think, and the president was a big champion of the national minimum wage, and it was one of the ways in which he forged this kind of consensus that brought him to power. And he's very good at creating these multi-stakeholder forums and getting everybody to agree. But who's not at those forums? It's the 8 or 9 million people who are unemployed, who are voiceless, have no representation. And so when we make these policy prescriptions, we must do so very carefully because there are unseen consequences to our actions. And many of these people are out of sight, out of mind, but are directly affected by these policies. So, I think a very good example, and I'll let you come in again there, Joe, is also our extension of collective bargaining agreements to non-parties. This is another very unfair practice, which is where you have, say, for example, an industry like the metalworking industry, you might, for example, have the major players, the big steel foundries, the metal fabricators, and the big unions in like the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa coming together, and they say, well, these are the wages that we want for the sector. And so these big businesses and these big established trade unions hammer out a deal. But then what the extension of collective bargaining uh, principle does is it then imposes that wage settlement on people who weren't there at the table. So if you're some small metal bashing shop in Pinetown and you weren't there at that big at that big forum, you have to now pay your workers what these other guys agreed. So that's also another strikingly unfair rule that just throws sand in the gears of South Africa's labor market.
Yeah, because like, this whole minimum wage thing. I've always had the opinion that like it's some people are gonna get angry, but like free market should decide. So like, and people get angry because they're like, yo, but then there's exploitation because then someone only gets paid 1 rand. But at the same time, I feel like a human being can tell someone like, if David, if I come to you and I'm like, dude, like I want to, I don't know, cut your garden. Okay, I'm being stereotypical now, but I want to cut your garden, and you say, well, I'll pay you like 2 rand an hour. I have the ability to say no and go to someone else who also needs their grass cut, and they might pay me 10 rand an hour or 20 rand an hour or whatever, maybe I need to prove myself, and I'll say, hey, I'll cut your grass this one time for free, and then if I do a good job, you hire me like on an ongoing basis every 2 weeks, and we negotiate a rate. I think that's how it should be done in a way. But when you start telling people or businesses that are starting out that want to employ people, but now there's a minimum wage which they can't afford because it's 20 rand an hour doesn't sound like much, but when you're paying someone 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for a month, that adds up. And a lot of people or a lot of businesses starting out can't afford that. Am I correct in saying that? Do I have a correct way of thinking? Because a lot of people seem to argue with me on that.
Yeah, so we mentioned the poor education outcomes in South Africa. But what happens is if you don't get a job essentially 7 years or so after matriculating, you're statistically never going to get a job in South Africa. So if you can get that first rung on the ladder, if you can just get that first job, even if it is a very low paid job, you can then use that to acquire the skills that you need to be more competitive in the market, and then use that to get your next job and gradually move your way up the ladder. Some people are not going to be able to do that. And you could make a case there for some kind of social protection, some social net. There's a lot of disruptive change. There's automation, there's AI, there's all sorts of things that are going to have negative impacts on the labor market. So I would say if you just got to make a bit of a trade-off. You can have social welfare protections for the poor and the vulnerable so that you don't fall through the cracks. But then you can't have that extensive welfare system and a highly rigid, protected labor market. This isn't Sweden, for example. We're a much poorer country. So I would say liberalize the labor market, make it much more easy for employers to hire people, because that's ultimately what job creation is. It's not something that government can really do, apart from those expanded public works programs and increasing the size of the civil service. But the real engine of job creation is the private sector. You need to make it easier for firms to hire. Part of that is also making it easier to fire. But at least then if you maybe can't cut it in the workforce, if you're then forced to the margins, then at least you've got some kind of income from the state. But this huge, extensive welfare state that is there because we have such deep structural unemployment. Also remember that, yeah, you could change all of these rules, but it's not going to change the labor market overnight. It's going to take time to inject more dynamism into and more flexibility into the labor market. So, I would not advocate for wholesale unbundling of the welfare system. I think it definitely needs to be reduced, but I would be much more radical on the labor policy. I would be creating, in the Eastern Cape, export processing zones, uh, uh, special economic zones where those labor laws just don't apply, apart from the kind of basic necessities of health and safety. Um, and you will see millions of people flocking to those areas if those were to be introduced. So, like what happened in China, for example. So I think that, on the one hand, I would say, maintain the some provision of welfare for the poor and the most vulnerable in society, but free up the labor market and inject a lot more dynamism and competition there.
No, I would agree with that. All right, cool. Well, that clears up a lot of things for me. And speaking of which, I see that we're almost out of time, so I just quickly want to go to some of the questions that I've been keeping an eye on. Some of them are comments, but I want to get to just a few of these. Clay Wilson asking David, what is CRA's thoughts on the current Russian-Ukraine situation effects on the South African economic and political landscape, or is it too soon to ask that question?
Well, yeah, so I think there are going to be some quite dramatic effects. So the first will be in terms of energy prices. So oil briefly went to $105 a barrel. We're seeing the cost of petrol at the pump going up. We've got a video on this tomorrow, incidentally, Clay. So
Okay,
do
cool.
check that out. But that's with our director, John Endres. And so that's going to mean that there are going to be some inflationary effects. South Africa is very dependent on fuel imports. We're a net importer of fuel, obviously. So that's going to affect us. Russia and Ukraine together are constitute approximately a quarter of all wheat production in the world. So there might be some effects in terms of food inflation. Fertilizer prices have been going up as a consequence of some of these supply chain issues. And then I think also geopolitically, there are going to be some really dramatic effects to this. Europe is now imposing very stringent sanctions on Russia. That's going to create all sorts of headwinds in the global financial markets. We've seen the ruble has tumbled 30% against the dollar. A lot of financial institutions are imposing, restrictions on the movement of Russian oligarchs' assets through the financial system, the SWIFT payment system. They're talking about freezing Russia out of that. So that's going to create also a lot of volatility in global markets. And there's been a lot of talk in developed market central banks to do what they call tapering, which is easing a lot of the stimulus that has been injected into global financial markets over the last 10 years or so. But that's going to also create flight of capital away from emerging markets. But now we might see that a lot of that tapering might actually be paused just because of this unexpected conflict. So I think also the world is going to be just generally in a much different place after this conflict. I don't think it's a very localized thing. I think NATO is going to play a much more expanded role. The EU, they're now openly talking about moving away from their dependence on Russian oil imports, going nuclear again. Germany has taken up a lot more of an adversarial stance in relation to Russia than it has over the last 20 or 30 years. So I think this has been a real game-changing event in the world, and South Africa is going to experience some effects from that.
Do you think World War III is on the cards?
Well, it depends on your definition of World War III. But I think something to look out for is what will China do in this context, because they have been doing a lot of saber rattling with regards to Taiwan, which it still sees as part of its territorial orbit, and might make a move on Taiwan. I don't think maybe this is perfect timing for them, but they might perceive America to be very weak. But Xi Jinping will probably also be watching what happens to Vladimir Putin. Perhaps he's overplayed his hand, Putin, that is, and we're still seeing things play out in Ukraine, but it seems that he's come up against more resistance than he bargained for, and also the severity of the economic sanctions, I think, is really going to bite. So maybe Xi Jinping will be keeping an eye on how things go there. But I think also we need to just look at the role of NATO over the last decades, and I think we must question this kind of ever eastward expansion, and I think that has antagonized Russia in many respects. So yeah, I think this is not just one lone lunatic. I think he's obviously the aggressor, Vladimir Putin, and the at the end of the day, it's the tanks that are rolling through a sovereign country are his. So he must bear that responsibility. But he is also perhaps responding to what he perceives as a threat from the West. So I think this has been quite a hard lesson in terms of realpolitik, in terms of trying to maintain stability, and how you do that is through the restrained demonstration of power. You need to use military power. I think this era of a kind of soft power only, that you can just negotiate your way through conflicts, I think has shown to be misplaced. And I think perhaps Europe is waking up belatedly to the fact that they also need to take their military role in the region more seriously, to act as a check against Russian aggression.
Interesting analysis. I look forward to the video that you guys will release tomorrow. Clay, I recommend that you make sure you catch it. And final question, because I know, like, we've spoken about this before. I know where you stand on it. But I know some of my viewers would be curious about this. So I've been asked to ask you, what is your thoughts on Cape Independence? This will be the final question, by the way.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, I interviewed Phil Craig on my podcast because I wanted to hear his perspective. And I think primarily what Cape Independence is driven by is a frustration with ANC misgovernance, and a feeling like that people in the Western Cape, although they have another party in the provincial administration in the form of the DA, that there are many roles and powers that are just beyond their scope, just because of the constitutional separation of powers. And I think that those are legitimate grievances. I think we have far too much centralization of power in South Africa, and that results in a lot of the kind of bad governance that we see. You think of Eskom, for example. It's a vertically integrated electricity monopoly, and there's no other game in town. And South Africans are kind of held hostage to this failing state-owned enterprise, and there are countless other examples of that. So I think that those grievances are very real, and I think that the Cape Independence movement is playing an important role in animating the discussion around federalism in South Africa and decentralization of power. And that theme of decentralization is something that I've dealt with quite a lot in my podcast, which is that it's better to disperse power. It's better to rely on local knowledge that people might have at the community level about how to create more prosperous economies, more secure communities, etc. But I'm still yet to be convinced that secession is the answer. I think that a confederal solution where you have much more devolution of power to the provincial level, I think is preferable. But I also think, what is interesting and compelling about the Cape Independence guys is is that getting you to think more critically about what is it that constitutes a nation state. And so what we might actually see is that the point becomes moot, that by default, South Africa starts to decentralize more, and local communities or cities start to push back against some of these governance failures. That might not come in the form of wholesale independence, but look at what the city of Cape Town is now doing. They're pushing for their own independent power producers to supply electricity directly to the municipality. That is now a regulatory window that has opened up because of the reforms that were essentially foisted upon the president when the lights were going out. So, I think that we're going to see a lot more bottom up, and I think that's certainly something to be encouraged. I would not give a full-throated endorsement of Cape independence. I would say that I would much rather see a more federal solution in South Africa, more decentralization of power.
All right. I knew that was the answer, but I just wanted the viewers to hear it for themselves. And yeah, we'll see what happens. Cape Independence is having a march, organized by CIAG and supported by Freedom Front Plus DA. I'm forgetting, of course, Cape Independence Party. Will you be there at the march, David? Come on, come to Cape Town. Come visit. Come.
Well, look, I'm a Joburger, so it's a bit of a stretch. But also, given my answer, I might be chased out.
No. Everybody's welcome. Everybody's welcome. I'm telling you, you must come. It's a Joel, dude. It's a party.
I'm sure. But I think it's also good that, I think the DA has obviously performed much better in the Western Cape, and, the results speak for themselves in terms of the Auditor General reports and all that stuff. But I think the Cape Independence Movement is playing a good pressure role on the DA as well to think, how can we actually be a bit more assertive about taking on more powers for the province, not just saying, well, we can't do anything about that. That's a national competency. But, like, for example, setting up these community safety groups that the new mayor has done. He's saying, well, I invite the police minister to try and stop me. And I think that's the kind of approach that we need. That's when I say, the decentralization, bottom-up approaches, that's exactly what I'm referring to.
Yeah, we know that the DA also is pushing for federalism. Well, again, only time will tell. I mean, CRA seems to think that ANC will not be in power come 2024. I don't know. I would like to think that myself, and who knows what will happen beyond 2024. But that might be a discussion for another day, David. I know you have to go, and I have to go, and we're a little bit over time. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming onto the show and staying a little bit longer than agreed upon. It really means a lot to me. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
Well, just wanted to say thanks very much for having me. I think it's always great to have a chat with you, and I think you've got some great subscribers as well who always ask such terrific questions. But I would encourage everyone to check out the CRA channel and also the Solutions podcast as well. And I think there's some really interesting, important conversations happening on those platforms. And it would be great to have you join us.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, you can go check out David at the CRA or on the CRA channel. Links in the description. So please go subscribe. David, once again, thank you so much. I'll chat to you soon.
Thanks, Joe.
Cheers, buddy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was David Ansara from Center for Risk Analysis and Solutions with David Ansara. Please go support him. And that was a very interesting conversation. That's why I wanted to have him on the show. This guy studies policies. He knows it. And I feel he was fair in his answers. And he told it straight. And that's why I wanted to have David on the show. Is a reliable person to chat to about these things. And what do you think, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that watch the show? Do you think the private sector is to blame for the decay of South Africa? I think David summed it up pretty nicely. I think he gave a very valid answer. Maybe the private sector is stuck between a rock and a hard place. depending on the business, depending on where it stands, depending on the size of the business and all that stuff. There's a lot to consider when we talk about this. But cronyism is definitely a problem. Corruption is definitely a problem. And at the end of the day, that all means that the ANC is the biggest problem. So, as always, ladies and gentlemen, Futsek ANC. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll be back tomorrow evening. I have an exciting show tomorrow evening before anybody goes. A panel discussion with Bongani from Action South Africa. That's right. I have a politician on the show, ladies and gentlemen. Bongani, who left the DA, went over to Action SA. And then I have John Endres, the CEO of IRR. And I have Martin van Staden from Sacherlich is going to be on the show. And what are we going to be discussing on panel night? We're going to be discussing the Zimbabwean permits that have been discontinued, for lack of a better term, and we're going to be talking about what is it everyone doing to perhaps resolve this. Is it right? And what is up with the rhetoric that Zimbabweans and foreigners are the reason why South Africans don't have jobs? We're going to be talking about that. It's going to be an interesting discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Please tune into that 8 p.m. tomorrow evening. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll probably talk about some other stuff as well, but it will mainly focus around that subject. It will mainly focus around that subject. Anyway, I gotta go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you guys so much for the likes, for the views, for the comments, for the questions. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. I'll be back tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. and then 8 p.m. It's panel night. Ladies and gentlemen, stay safe, be kind to one another, and I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.